Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 313 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host, the green... Oh, no, I'm not the green tank.
No.
I'm the orange tank. Wow, Mark, it's...
That was a Freudian slip, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was going to say, I feel like I almost had an excuse that it's been a while, but I was on last week's episode, so I don't really have an excuse.
It's your inner truth coming out.
Exactly. Everyone wants to be the green tank.
That's true.
That's the truth of it. No, they don't. Everyone wants to be the orange tank. I am the orange tank. I am Neelan, and with me is the green tank.
Hello.
How are you doing, Mark?
I'm good.
Excellent.
What would you say to
that
everybody?
That is it.
What would you say to everybody who wants to be the red tank today?
They
are
get luck. Exactly. No such luck today. Or, depending how you look at it, you could be the red tank this week.
Oh, yeah.
He's not around. He's not going to stop you.
The listener is the red tank this week.
Exactly.
So feel free to curse and rest assured that I won't be bleeping them as much as I do accounts.
This week, we're going to be talking about some first impressions. This was a topic that was suggested to us by Jaron. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But the premise of his topic was about first plays that were so bad based on circumstances that we eventually turned around on, or alternatively, just sullied that game for forever. That's going to be coming up in the second half of the episode. But before we do that, let's talk about the games that Mark and I have been playing this week. And this week, we're going to be talking about Things in Rings, Yedo, and Harmonies.
Things in Rings, this is that new party game, right, from All Play?
Yeah. This is one of those ones that I feel like if you've seen it, it would have made a strong impression because it's got a very cool visual component to it. So Things in Rings is a pretty light party game. It's the sort of light game where you're not so invested in being the person that wins. It's not super competitive. It's just very experiential. It's quite novel. The premise is that you're trying to sort cards into a very simple makeshift Venn diagram. And the thing that's lovely about the production is they literally give you 3 giant colored loops of string, like a red loop, a blue loop, and a yellow loop. You overlay them over each other on the table to create like this Venn diagram. So there's a section where the red and the blue overlap, the blue and the yellow, and then a section right in the middle where all 3 rings overlap. And then the person, who I believe in the parlance of the game is called the knower, gets 3 broadly attributes that correspond to each of the rings, okay? So the blue ring always is an actual physical attribute about these objects. Like, is it made of metal, for example, just as a completely arbitrary example. The yellow ring is always about a quality about the word itself. Does it have 2 syllables, for example? And then the red one is the context in which it's used. Is it used in a home? What job is it used in? That sort of thing. Everyone then gets a hand of cards that are just various nouns like hammer, church, elephant, and so on. And on your turn, you're going to take one of those cards and put it into a spot in the Venn diagram. Okay? I think that the elephant card I have qualifies for the yellow category. But to be clear, only the knower knows what the yellow category is at the start of the game. So I'm going to put that in the yellow ring, but not so it's in the red ring and not so it's in the blue ring. So let's say we're going to stick to this example. And the category for the yellow ring, known only to the knower, is 2 syllables. So obviously, elephant doesn't fit in the yellow ring. Okay? It doesn't have 2 syllables.
Right.
So the knower will then take that card out, and they'll say, no, actually it goes over in this section. It actually fits with the red ring, but not the blue ring or the yellow ring. So it goes into that section of the Venn diagram, okay? Or alternatively, they'll just say, correct, that's it, and no more information. And you just keep doing this going around the table until you start to, individually and as a group, kind of communally learn what the categories are. It's like you're testing things basically, and you're saying like, okay, what is connecting these things together? What could the yellow circle possibly be? How could this be in this group and not this group? And you get some intuition over, oh, this is all the metal things. Oh, okay, I get that these are the 2-syllable words and these other ones don't. And you can start testing all the cards as you go around the table. On your turn, if you get it correct, you get to go again. And if you get it incorrect, you have to draw another card and then pass to the next player. So the first person to run out their entire hand by sort of correctly categorizing 5 cards wins the round. And that's the gist of it. That's kind of the whole game. You just keep doing that. You know, you rotate who the knower is. They draw 3 new categories for the 3 rings. And that's the whole game. It's very simple. I found it fun to play, and I think that back to the thing I alluded in the beginning, you can't be too you can't be too hung up on the winning of this, because a lot of the times it feels very arbitrary. We definitely had games where people didn't know what any of the 3 categories were, but kind of had some feel-ski based on the cards that were on the table. Because the thing that happens very often, for example, one thing that happened in one of our games was there's also a section that is like the none section. You know, it doesn't apply to any of these 3 categories, any of the 3 rings. And a lot of the times you'll see, animals are accumulating in the none section. So you know that you can safely play an animal to the none, and it's likely going to be none as well. So that kind of starts to happen more often than not, where you're not entirely sure what the categories are, but you have a reasonably good idea where something is going to go based on its similarity to something else on the board. And that doesn't always feel great. Like, you kind of want people to win because they figured out the game, right? And sometimes that happens. Obviously, there's like a difficulty rating to each of these cards, but some of them felt really out of whack, or sometimes we'd get to the end and be like, how would anyone have ever gotten that? It just kind of felt entirely bizarre. But the times where you do figure it out, and especially when you figure it out ahead of someone else at the table, and you're like, you can start, put a card down, and you're like, nah, not there, it's definitely not there, and you're saying it before the knower even says it. That feels fun. Like, you feel smug when you know something.
I can imagine playing this with like 4 or 5 people, and then like 3 of the people know what one is, and then they all sort of like have a conspiratorial look at each other when somebody places something that's obviously in the wrong spot, and they know,
Okay. And those are the best moments. I will say it's not riotous in the way that you want party games of this type to be. It just kind of has that kind of almost like what you said, that knowing smugness of looks around the table sort of going around.
Yeah.
But I thought it was cute. I worry that it's more of a novelty than something that's going to have like long-term appeal. I also, very specifically even, I'm sure you could just keep coming up with cards and like create like, expansions, for lack of a better word.
Sure.
But it did feel like you would start to get a handle on the sorts of categories that were in the game. Like, there's really only so much you can do with the words category in terms of symbol count and things like that, word length. So it felt like it would maybe like run its course after a little while. But yeah, hard to say. We played a few games of it, and it seemed pretty fun all 3 of those times.
How long did the games run, out of curiosity?
10 minutes.
Okay.
Like 10 minutes
interesting.
each. Yeah, it's breezy. It's super breezy.
When you first were describing this game, before the idea that you mentioned you don't want to go into it playing it really necessarily to win so much, and that didn't really click to me as a, hey, this is still going to be a competitive game, because when you started describing it, I assumed this was like a cooperative game where, there was going to be a person who knew what the categories were, and then everybody was supposed to like talk about, okay, if we place it here, then that. But it's not that. And I actually sort of like, again, I haven't played this game, so I don't know how it works in practice, but I like the idea that you have like a small deck of cards, and if you figure out how to place them, you can run out your deck and win. And I assume maybe there's even ways where a person, well, you sort of alluded to this, that you don't necessarily need to nail down what the 3 circles are and can still win if you have like the vibe, or even, I guess you could even sort of luckily, if you had just any kind of sense, you could maybe place it in the right. Yeah.
To both of those points, like the thing I remember about one of the games I played of it was there was the moment where I felt really great. I had 3 cards in my hand, and I was like, I know where each of these 3 cards go. And it was like, bam, 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 get wrecked, I won. Like that. Yeah. And that felt great because I felt confident about it, but I was actually a little bit off about one of the categories, like not in a way, obviously, that hurt me, but in a way that I felt like, I had the whole thing nailed.
Yeah.
And it kind of felt a little bit deflated and be like, I didn't even really have to know what that category was to still be able to win. It still feels competitive in the sense that you want to win. Like, in the sense you want to definitely be the person to run at your hand. But a lot of the times we kind of just felt like it felt somewhat arbitrary. Not entirely, but there was a degree of arbitrariness where it was just like, well, if none of us knows what these are, then what does it matter that someone won, It
even feels like you very easily could play this cooperatively if you because my next question was like, would this game work for non-gamers? If you just had family around, would this game work, or is it too gamery for them? But I feel like whatever your answer is, and I would like to know what the answer is, you could have like a knower play against everybody, and everybody could sort of talk it out, and the game could be figuring out what the 3 categories are.
I think that would totally work. And sometimes the games, like, to some extent, the games devolved into that. Like one of the games that I ran and was the knower, that was the one that went on the longest without anyone really knowing literally no one at the table knew what any of the 3 categories was. But the person who won, kind of the way he described it was kind of funny. It was almost like he felt like an AI. Like, he was able to categorize the things without really understanding it.
Sure.
Like, you get some sense based on the pools of cards of like what works and what doesn't. Even that is kind of like a fun exercise. Even if, not having to know the category and still being able to feel like you've intuited something, I think is still fairly clever. But yeah, doing that as a group, group, because what I did at the end of that game is we kind of just went around the table and was all, it's like, well, what do you guys think these categories are? And there was like discussion as they tried to figure it out. So you could easily turn this into a cooperative game. Very neat. All players production is as lovely as ever. That is Things in Rings.
So I finally got a chance to play Yedo. This is a game that came out back in 2012, designed by Thomas van Ginst and Wolf Planck. The version I played, however, is the very fancied up 2020 Yedo Deluxe Master Set version that was released by Board and Dice. First question I have, what's with the word master in there? Yedo Deluxe Master Set. As opposed to what, like Yedo Deluxe Average Set? I don't understand the master part.
I feel like I've seen Master Set being used in games in the context that, is it just like it has everything? Like it has like all the expansions, all the content? Is that the idea?
I guess so. It just makes me think of like, it gives me this image of them going back into dusty archives and they found the master mold for Yedo and they like blew off the dust and decided to release it or something. But anyway.
It's funny because the only other example I can think of is like 51st State is
Master
like
Set.
A Master Set, right? And that is like a big box basically.
Yeah,
right?
I guess so. I guess Master does include like expansions, and Deluxe wouldn't necessarily mean that. But anyhow, so joking about the whole Master Deluxe set, but I've got to say it is a heck of a production. I never played the original, and yet one of the main things I heard about it was the production was beautiful. This is, again, by pre-2012 Kickstarter crazy standards. And that high level of beauty and production certainly comes through in this Deluxe Master Set. Everything here is done lavishly without going overboard, I think, as a lot of, I think overproduced Kickstarters can. The board is great. The unique meeples are great. Card art is absolutely lovely. It all makes you feel like you're playing a premium, quote-unquote, experience without getting in the way, without being a little overblown. This might get a little confusing, but before I talk about how the game is actually played, I want to mention another part of this Deluxe Master Set, and that's how modular it is. Again, going to your thing about Master being, including all the expansions. This is a game with a lot going on, but a core part revolves around 3 sets of cards that you're going to encounter during the course of the game. There's action cards that are sort of game-breaking, rule-breaking stuff that lets you do stuff that you can't normally do. There are event cards that get played every turn and affect all players. And most crucially, there are these mission cards, which are basically recipe fulfillment and are, for a great degree, the center of the game and why you're doing most of the things you're doing. In the cases of all these cards, all these 3 sets of cards, and other aspects of the game as well, you can tailor the kind of game you want to play by using different sets of cards. What I mean is, like, if you want to play a confrontational game, you can use the confrontational set of those 3 cards and mix those into the sets of cards you use. If you want to play a game that focuses on the economy, there's like an economic set that you can mix in. If you want to play with the expansion, this is yet another module that introduces meeples with special powers, there's a set for that you can mix in. So whatever flavor you want of Yedo, you can really customize the game to suit exactly the taste that you want. What that means is a longish setup time, but the storage system for the Deluxe Master Set of the game is done really, really well and helps make that take much less time than otherwise would. So, as far as the game itself, every round, and incidentally, the number of rounds you play is also a choice you make. I'll talk more about that later. But anyway, every round starts with this bidding phase for some type of resource. The lot of things you'll be bidding on depends on the player count, but it's a cool take on bidding that I liked. The way it works is the first player, in turn order, is going to propose a section to bid on, and then they are forced to bid that section's minimum bid. So if you want to do like bid for one section of resources, you are forced to bid the minimum bid. Then each other player can either bid or pass once. It's a once around. And then it gets back to the player who proposed that section, and then they can either raise the bid or pass unless no one else has bid, in which case they must buy for the minimum. If they win the lot, the choice of the next lot goes to the next player in turn order. Otherwise, if somebody else won that lot, the player who chose that first lot gets to choose the next lot. Make for some interesting decisions where you might choose a section you weren't necessarily interested in, so someone else can pay and spend their money, and you can get something that you actually want cheaper. I didn't mention this, but once you've won one of these bidding lots in the auction phase, you can't bid for anything else. So like if you get somebody to bid for something that you don't really necessarily want, you sort of get them out of that phase, and you can again buy something you actually want for a lesser amount of money. After that bidding phase, there's the event card phase, or the event phase, whatever, where an event card is flipped that affects all players, as event cards do in all games. Then after that, you're going to assign your meeples around the board, or as they're known in this game, your disciples. There are 7 regions of the board. Each of them have a limited number of spots, and all of them allow you to gain the resources that you need, or more action cards or more mission cards. I mentioned mission cards and how important they are. Now that I brought them up, let me talk about them again. So mission cards, as I mentioned, are the heart of the game. They come in 4 flavors. There's green, yellow, red, and black, and that matches an ascending order of difficulty in completing the missions. So you got the simple green cards all the way to the very difficult black cards. The colors also correspond, no surprise, to the level of rewards you get for accomplishing the task. So the green and yellow cards will give you some resources, maybe a little bit of victory points. The red and black cards give you a lot more resources and generally a lot more victory points. A little bit more about accomplishing the tasks since they're so central to the game. They often require that you put meeples in specific spots on that shared board in the meeple assigning phase I just mentioned. These missions might require that you pick up certain weapons or blessings or geishas or annexes, which are all resources that you can pick up either in that bidding phase or during that action phase by playing your meeples on the board. So those are the mission cards. You're basically getting them through the course of the game. You'll always be cycling them into your hand and completing them. But once you've placed your meeples, this figure, which is the watch patrol figure, is going to move around the center of the board, and whatever section they land in, all the meeples are arrested unless you have some way to mitigate that. Sounds harsh. It is harsh, but this meeple only usually travels one spot in a specific direction, so there's not much of a surprise as to what spot he's going to block off, and so you more or less know what to do and how to avoid it. After that phase, the players will move their meeples and just get the resources or complete the missions based on where they are on the board, and then that's repeated round to round. So how often that's repeated, as I mentioned earlier, how many rounds there are in the game, is something you, again, decide on before you start the game. So let's talk about that here. There's what's called the standard 6-round game. There's the longer 8-round game, and then there's the full, what I guess is the original length of the game, which is 11 rounds. I would very strongly suggest that you never play the 11-round game. We played a couple of 8-round games, and when you teach the game and learn the game, it sounds like it's going to be pretty quick, and it generally is. There's not like too much brain burning here, but 11 rounds is going to be quite a long time. We played a couple of 8-round games. They lasted about 2.5 hours, and more importantly than how much time is spent considering your moves, I think an 8-round game, you definitely get a sense and have like a satisfying feeling about what Yedo is offering. I think that's more than enough to like give you the Yedo experience. That is a little tempered by the fact that trying to accomplish those black difficulty cards that I mentioned is really, really hard. And in an 8-round game, you're barely going to get 1 or 2 of those done if you're lucky. Actually, using the term "if you're lucky" is a perfect phrase to use to move to the next part of this review. Is for as long as this game is, and as modular and like the way you can fine tune it to sort of suit your taste. One of the negatives that I found, and I think this was a common refrain with all the players I played with, was that it can feel like quite a lucky game. I mentioned you're going to do a lot of missions, and so that sort of mitigates it. You know, you're going to be doing a lot of these, so inherent in that is if you have a mission you're not going to be able to do, you probably have another one that you in your hand that you are going to be able to do, or you can go get another one. The problem is that it can feel very lucky or unlucky to draw a mission that you just happen to have everything for, you know? And on the other hand, like you can find yourself drawing a couple mission cards and just realize you're like not very well suited to get them done quickly, or because some of the resources are limited, piece limited, you can find yourself, especially with the harder missions, drawing mission cards that are impossible to accomplish. Like you will draw a mission card. This happened to one player in the game quite harshly. It happened to all of us, but one player it happened quite harshly to, where they kept drawing mission cards and they realized the units they needed, the resources they needed, were taken by other players, and they could not accomplish these missions. That felt pretty harsh. And for a game that goes as long as it does, it can feel really bad when you just are locked out because of the luck of the draw and these mission cards, which again, so crucial in the game. There's also the event cards. In our game, they weren't necessarily super harsh in a way that event cards can be. Event cards can often feel like injections of randomness that can hurt players arbitrarily. Didn't really have a heavy dose of that, but it did affect players in a way that felt sort of unfair. We happened to have a game where the first couple of event cards punish the player in first position, or the first player, in a way that felt arbitrary and just messed them up for getting themselves in a good position, which wasn't super great. A game that I've heard this compared to, in fact, a player that we were playing with compared it to this was Lords of Waterdeep, in the fact that it is so heavy on the recipe fulfillment. And it's not a one-to-one comparison, but it certainly is there. Even though I'm not a huge fan of Lords of Waterdeep, And even though the production for Yedo is fantastic and it's just, again, feels like such a premium experience, for as long as Yedo takes and for as much as luck feels like it gets in the way and just can make the experience feel a little arbitrary, it's hard for me not to think of Lords of Waterdeep as a game that I would sort of prefer. Now that's gonna be, just me, because Lords of Waterdeep is not necessarily like the breeziest, quickest game in the world, but it's certainly going to be shorter than Yedo. And I would say that if you don't mind some luck, and if you are a person who really likes the modularity of some games, especially like a deluxe production that is, again, game aside, and of course the game part is the biggest part, but like the way that this is packaged and the way that everything is, like, again, as I mentioned, like the way that the inside is set up, the storage system and accessing things is really, really well done. If that is a big part of your experience, and I can totally get that, where the game is lavish as this, and again, you like the modularity, you like being able to fine tune things, and you don't necessarily mind games that can inject luck and have a, sort of a rough card draw, then Yedo's great. The Japanese art and that whole thing really helps. Again, this is aided by the premium production and everything, but that is a big part of it that I can see being a big appeal. I just think that it just goes on too long. Again, I would never go with 11-round game. Maybe a 6-round game mitigates that length, but again, a 6-round game would make the randomness even feel harsher, so it's hard to see that being such a mitigation. I've played a lot of these older games. Again, Yedo came out originally in 2012, and I really appreciate the cleanness of a lot of older designs and the simplicity of a lot of older designs. This doesn't really match that. It doesn't necessarily feel bloated, but it just feels a little overlong and, again, over punishing. I've heard that if you play with which we didn't do, play with the confrontational cards, it can be even more punishing, where, you can set yourself up to, like, okay, I've got everything I need to accomplish these tasks, and then cards can be used to, like, just remove them from your board or have players take them. So that would be infuriating, frankly. Even though I like confrontational games, for a game that requires this much setup and this much planning, that would be rough. So I wish I could recommend Yedo. I don't think I can, but it may be for some folks out there. If you're a fan of, again, Lords of Waterdeep, and like that recipe fulfillment and want it to the nth degree and don't mind, again, some randomness, some length, then it could be perfect for you, but a miss for me, unfortunately.
It's funny because your comparison to Lords of Waterdeep is, like, it kind of felt like the nail in the coffin to me, because Waterdeep strikes me, although it was a very formative game for a lot of people, like very milquetoast in 2024 in a way that just makes feel like if you preferred that as an experience to this, that kind of feels like very damning of Yedo.
Yeah. I mean, it is definitely milquetoast, I would say, in general, and I would say that it is milquetoast in relation to Yedo, which is, again, a way of, like, praising Yedo, because it is more of an exciting experience. Again, maybe it just feels more, again, lavish, more like like the pieces are so great and everything feels so nice and everything looks so great. But if the gameplay is more important to you and you don't want to be there for that long, I think the trade-off between the two games, for me, tips quite a bit in the Waterdeep sort of side of things. Again, I will say I think definitely that won't be for everyone. I think other people will accept the trade-off of a longer game time for the more fine-tuned experience of Yedo. But for me, I couldn't quite get there, even though everything inside me, with playing all these older games, I just wanted this to be another one of those sort of experiences, but fell a little short. So that is Yedo by Thomas van Ginst and Wolf Planck. This was the board and dice version, the Deluxe Master Set, 2020 by Board and Dice.
I'm going to talk about another small game called Harmonies. This is published by Libelud and designed by Johan Benvenuto. Harmonies is a lovely little brain-burny puzzle game. It has shades of Azul in it, where kind of what you're trying to do is draft these little tokens, our little discs, and assemble them on your board for the most points. What you are trying to do in Harmonies is, the tokens in Harmonies are 6 different colors of discs that kind of represent sort of parts of your landscape. So you have a little hex board. On every turn of the game, you're going to choose one of the central wells and take all of the tokens from that well of these 6 different colors. You're going to place all of those onto your board, refill the center, and then the next player does their thing. What these tokens represent is 6 different terrain types, and the way that you're trying to assemble in your board is to accomplish 2 different goals broadly. The first one being kind of just each token type scores in a different way at the end of the game. So this might be very familiar if you've played sort of like city building games. Like, let's say, for example, for your blue tokens, you want to make the longest river across your board. For the yellow tokens, every cluster of 2 or more scores 5. So you don't want to have big clusters, you want to have lots of clusters. Your mountains score based on how highly stacked they are, and so on. So each of these token types scores in different ways at the end of the game. But that's only one half, and maybe arguably the weaker half of Harmonies. The second part of this are these animal cards that you draft. On your turn, you can take one from the center, place it in sort of a little storage area off to the side, and that animal card has up to 4 or 5 tokens on it, where if you're able to attract that token to your board, you will get gradually increasing points. You do that by creating patterns represented on that card. So let me kind of just try to break this down with an example. You draft an alligator card. That alligator card specifically wants a blue token next to a tree. And every time you then create a blue token, that arrangement of a blue token next to a tree, you take one of the alligator tokens off of that card, you put it onto your blue token, and now you're going to get some points for that alligator at the end of the game. You can do that multiple times, but you're going to have to find different arrangements. Some components of the arrangement can be reused for other arrangements, but if it has an animal token on it already, you can't put another token on there in the future. So you could use that tree again by putting another water token next to it, but you won't be able to use that water token to attract another alligator. So you're trying to find the creative ways to sort of create these little patterns across your landscape. But you can have up to 4 of these animals in storage. So it's this clever puzzle of trying to figure out ways to, with any component you're building on your board, to effectively be sort of satisfying multiple patterns. This water is going to be helping out with both my alligator and then also this duck card. Okay, and then if I create this pattern over here, I'm also creating 1/3 of what I need to create this other pattern over here. And you're trying to do that all in tandem with creating your landscape points at the end of the game. So you have these multiple competing goals at any given time that just feel very, almost like Calico-like, to sort of try and map your head around. It's like, okay, if I put this here, it works great for this, but it really messes up this other thing. And at any given time, because you're forced to take 3 tokens, there's always this sort of trade-off of like, okay, I really want these 2, but I don't really have a good place for this one. And then you do that lovely thing where you put something down and realize 2 turns later that the last thing you should have done was put that token in that exact spot. It ends up creating this like really lovely stacked, up to 3-layer high, like 3D terrain thing with these animals all over it. So it's quite a lovely looking thing. It's a very simple game that is deceptively complex in that sort of like pattern creation. And I had a lovely time with this. I thought this was really good, and I'm looking forward to playing more of it.
Yeah, this definitely feels a little bit like a mixture of Azul and, as you said, Calico, a little bit of Cascadia.
Yeah, for sure. Some of that. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Like that creating of terrain types and the pattern matching is definitely very Cascadia.
Yeah.
The most damning thing I think I could say about this is that it has very little interaction. At best, what you're doing is taking 3 tokens that someone next to you wants, but because the specific puzzle you're trying to assemble is so harsh, you're very rarely doing that to hurt another player, I would say. Or at least it was the furthest consideration of mine what other people were doing. I would get annoyed when someone took the stuff I wanted, but that was kind of the extent of it. Like, you're largely just building your own puzzle and trying to score it as effectively as possible by the end of the game. So that's a little bit of a knock against it, but for a mostly solitaire puzzle experience, I thought this one was really good.
Yeah, it seems like it would move at a pretty good clip, too. I'm seeing 30 to 45 minute playing time. Is that pretty much right?
That is exactly right. Like, having played this now twice to 3 players, both of those games were about half an hour each.
You think it has staying power? I mean, it's going up against some pretty big hitters in the field. I'm seeing that it's at least getting quite positively reviewed. It's, I guess, risen to the number 3 abstract game of all time on BGG. So that's quite a...
I mean, I would say so. Like this is the sort of game that I don't think I would ever turn down, because I love that sort of puzzle. Like that is just so my jam, and the sort of thing I love fiddling with, that I would never be mad to play this. Yeah. It's also the sort of game where I can't see it having like a short tail, because you know entirely what the game is after game 1. So you either love that, you're not going to be finding like hidden depths to this, like 3 games in terms of like new experiences, but you are just going to get better and better at the puzzle of it. So it's definitely lovely in that sense, for sure.
That's cool.
But yeah, that is Harmonies by Johan Benvenuto and Libelud. So, before we get on to our feature topic, we got a little bit of business to handle here in the middle. First, we've got a draft result to announce, and it could not thrill me more to announce that the winner is not here to gloat about it.
Perfect. Love that.
Kellen swept this one. I don't think it's unfair to say that he
crushed
house.
us. This was, yeah.
With 55% of the vote, the El Grande. I'm just going to say, you know what? El Grande. That's what won.
That seems to be the case.
You didn't need anything more than that.
Seems to be the case, yeah.
Kellen's picks cleaned up with 55% of the vote. We were having a bit of a fight that kind of turned over the course of the results as I was watching them, but I came in second with 24% of the vote, and unfortunately, Mark, 21% of the vote.
Did I finish third? I thought I finished second. Oh my God, even worse.
Yeah, I think I caught up to you, because I was coming in third for most of it, and I think that tail end ends up with me taking.
Oh my gosh!
But it was pretty close between us, regardless. So, if you voted, you may have won, and the person that did win, your email address starts with an N and ends with 2002. So, expect an email from us shortly to get your gift voucher. Thank you so much for voting. Love the draft.
You know what? Speaking of vouchers, I'm starting to wonder, because Callan is the guy who pushed the $100 voucher. Is this like a pro Callan is giving us more money vote? Is he buying his votes?
Wow. I think that could
be it.
That makes sense.
That could be it. That makes a lot of sense to me.
I didn't think about that, but that's a very good point.
This is corruption at its worst. This is a big voting year in the U.S., and Callan is showing us the worst of democracy.
Exactly. The other thing that I would want to call out is we always love when we get reviews from everyone. And the review that we're going to read today comes from Einar MS, and it's titled Cozy Chats About Board Games. They say, very nice podcast with great banter. The hosts are all very likable and have a diverse range of tastes in board games, making it all the more relevant as a way to discover good games for you. And that review comes from Norway, rounding out our Scandinavian portion of the review section, which seems to be a recurring.
The Scandinavians give us good reviews, and the Australians win our draft.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But yeah, the reviews are great for us. They're a good way to push up the rankings of the podcast behind the scenes, make sure more people see it. So hugely appreciate that, anyone that leaves us reviews, and we may read yours on a future episode. Let's get into our feature topic, Mark.
Yes, excited for this one.
So I want to restate this a little bit as it was written by Jaren, and you can do the same thing if you want to suggest us a topic that we might discuss in a future episode. I hugely appreciate that. We definitely don't get around to covering all of them, but we definitely read them all, so hugely appreciate any of the suggestions.
And we need all the help we can get.
I should mention
all the help we can get.
Yeah, exactly. And I should mention that even we forgot to say this last episode, but the Spiel winners draft was a suggestion from a listener as well, so they're all hugely appreciated. You can do that at boardgamebarrage.com/topics. Just like Jaren did, where they said, one bad play. Have you ever enjoyed your first few or even many plays of a game, only for one play to go so awry that you feel disillusioned afterwards? I find it can be difficult to separate the context from the game itself in such situations, so I tend to give the game the benefit of the doubt. There are some games that have been ruined for me, though, and I'd love to hear you all discuss any similar experiences. Alternatively, what games made horrible first impressions but have come to be something that you really enjoy? So there is a prototypical example of this that I've definitely mentioned before, so I'm not going to elaborate on it too much. But my first experiences of both Brass Birmingham and Hansa Teutonica could not have been under worse circumstances. I believe I played them both for the first time at the same game day, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And it wasn't anything to do with specific people or so much that. It was just a very noisy environment, a very awful place to be learning to, relatively heavy in the case of Hansa, but quite heavy in the case of Brass Birmingham games for the first time, where I just kind of didn't feel like I could absorb or taken away to them. And both of those games have gone on to be I think they're both in my top 20 at this point. So I definitely don't think that those games could have been in danger of just being ruined forever. And I think in the case of Hansa, it definitely took a long time for me to come around to playing it again for a second time. But yeah, I dread to think of the idea that I just never would have played either of those games ever again based on that experience.
Yeah, my first example of a game that went from bad to good is one that I've talked about often on the show, and one of the main reasons I've talked about it is because it's jumped so high on my top 50 games of all time, and that is Agricola. And I think this was in the same vein as your situation. It wasn't a bad environment, but my first play of Agricola came fairly early in my entry into the board game hobby, and I was playing it against folks that were just really, really good at it. And I just got absolutely crushed. And I actually played it a couple times. It wasn't just my first play. It was like my first 3 plays or 4 plays of it. I was just getting hammered at it. And, maybe it's a function of me being a competitive person. I think mostly it's a function of the fact that Agricola can really punish you if you fall behind in certain aspects of it. But I just was turned off of Agricola severely for a long, long time. Dan is a listener of the show and a friend of ours, and he is one of the primary culprits of why I initially hated Agricola, because he was just such a good player. But with more seasoning, well, I was going to say with more time in the hobby, but that's not actually even true. Like, that first couple games was such a bad impression that I stayed away from Agricola, even after playing a lot more games, even after like feeling like, okay, that was early on. Maybe now that I've played more games, I'll be more up to speed when it comes to games like that. But it was such a bad first taste. But then, Agricola is so universally loved, and I liked a lot of other Rosenberg games, and I decided to, I'm actually just going to do a deep dive of Agricola strategy and just how the cards work, just get an idea, just get my feet wet, get an idea of what it's like, and played a couple games of it after that, and my feeling about it completely changed, where now it was my second favorite game of all time in the last top 50 episode, and have just grown to love the card combinations and different things you can do, and even the ruthlessness of it, which I still fall prey to. I still find myself getting some of those beggar cards and losing the valuable points, but still just appreciating it so much. So, and I think that's happened to me in a couple games over the years, especially games I played early on where I just got destroyed and just that turned me off. I don't know, does that happen to you? I just wonder if that's more a function of me having the competitiveness of games be such an important part of it. Do you get turned off when a person crushes you at a game that is sort of low on luck but can be brutal, or are you okay? Can you brush that off and say, oh, I don't know it as well as this other person and I'm okay with it, and you're able to shake it off?
Yeah. I think I'm generally good at being able to shake it off. There are 2 specific examples, I think, that are actually kind of that same thing that went in completely opposite directions. Race for the Galaxy, another one I've spoken about a lot. Like, I had a negative experience of it, and then when I came back to it later, I kind of just didn't really enjoy it all that much. And who's to say? Maybe some of that was trumped by that negative experience. But Tigris and Euphrates was kind of the opposite, where I had a very intensely negative experience the first time I played it, came back to it later, because, a lot of the times you can recognize something in the game, even when you do really, really terribly at it. And I mean, in fact, that was my experience with Brass, was, I had a bad game of it. I did badly, but I could see that I knew I wanted to play it again. I could see a core of something that I really, really needed to revisit. And that was the case with Tigris. I came back to it a couple of times later. I never really entirely turned the corner of it being a game I love, but by the time Yellow and Yangtze rolled around, I sort of fell in love with that, went back to play more and more Tigris, especially since it's been on BGA. And I'm now at the point where I recognize how solid of a game it is, and how much my appreciation of it has grown, despite thinking it was just something I was never going to like as much. It's the sort of thing where I've now gotten to the point now where I think about Tigris versus Yellow. I still, not that this is the topic, but I still prefer Yellow, but I recognize more and more why people like Tigris. There's something specific in there that is quite harsh and quite exacting and quite punishing that is not to my taste, but I think it's the reason that people prefer it over Yellow and Yangtze. And yeah, it took me a while to come around on that, absolutely. But I think generally I can think of a lot of times where I had intensely negative competitive experiences of a game, and they ended up being games that I felt compelled to come back to and really, really enjoy. The Great Zimbabwe is another fantastic example where it's I could not have had more of a miserable time in my first
I was there for that one. I didn't think you would have that bad of a time, but I
don't know if you were there for my first game.
I was.
You? Yeah. Oh, you were? Yeah, I really, really disliked it. I think I was, if I remember that game specifically, I was trying to mask a little bit how much I disliked that play of it to some extent, because it's just teaching me this game. It's hot garbage. We just played it for 3 hours. But anyway, no, that's a game that's now, if it's not still in my top 50, has been in my top 50.
You mentioned BGA, like playing Tigris on BGA and sort of like getting...
Yeah.
I think BGA is a good segue into a game I have both on the bad first impression went to good and good first impression went to bad. So on the bad to good side, Arc Nova, again, another game that is I've talked about because it's in my top 50 games now of all time. You taught us Arc Nova, and it was a good experience. Like when you taught it well, and it was a pleasant game, but I thought it was just like not something that was like that exciting. I thought it was just like another game and pleasant, but I would have rated it if you asked me at the time like a 6 or something, just fine. And I think I even mentioned it when we had the first review. BGA has allowed me to play more of it, and it has really grown in my estimation as a result. This is one of the best parts of BGA is because we're reviewers, but also because the hobby sort of just leans this way. We play a lot of games 1 or 2 times, and then that's it. And that's just something that is just, I think, a little bit regrettable given our situation and against the circumstances of the hobby. But BGA, because you can have a game just sitting there and you don't have to worry about having people come over at a certain time, or you have to, like the table space, you can just have a game going asynchronously. It allows you to play games more often, and I've been able to play Arc Nova quite a bit now, and it has just grown in my estimation because of it. The card comboing and like the different things it has to offer, the ability to pivot when one strategy isn't working is something I really appreciate. So it's a game that has, again, really, really grown in my estimation as a result of BGA specifically, because it has allowed me to play it over and over again. I think this is another like category of bad first impression, or in this case, mediocre first impression to a growing enjoyment of it, is games that flourish when you play them more often. They allow for unlocking strategies or seeing things that maybe aren't apparent in that very first play.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And not to the same extent for sure, but like I had a somewhat negative experience first game of Through the Ages, just by virtue of the fact that, again, I was playing against people that had played a lot. I was playing it for the first time. I was still new to the board game group a little bit, so I was a little bit intimidated and kind of just felt like, oh, this is a long, hard, complex game that I'm being sort of destroyed at. But that was a good example of one that I sort of saw. I immediately saw that, oh, I know I'm going to like this. But it really took me playing it digitally, not on Board Game Arena so much, but through the app version, to have that game just go up and up and up and up and up and up in my estimation, to the extent that it's basically my favorite game. Like, there is something to be said for just like getting so down the rabbit hole on a single game that you can kind of only really do when you're playing it online or digitally. That makes a massive difference for your appreciation of a thing, for sure.
Yeah, I wish that I had that initial feeling from Arc Nova that were like, oh, maybe this is not the greatest play of it, but I can see something. I didn't even see that. Like, the only reason I played it online was, it's a relatively popular game. Obviously, not even relatively, it's a very popular game. And, when it came out on BGA, I had friends who wanted to play it, and only through that was I able to play it more often and really see all it had to offer. On the other hand, a game that has gone from a good first impression to now a game that I don't really ever want to play again is Seven Wonders Duel. And this is for the same reason. Seven Wonders Duel was, a 2-player version of Seven Wonders, has a couple of different ways that you can win, like through a military victory, a science victory, or through, points the normal way. And I thought that was great. I thought it was a very interesting way to do Seven Wonders for 2 players. The way that you play the cards, like some of the cards that you can pick from are exposed and some are not, and some become exposed depending on how you pick them, and the sort of like zero-sumness of it when you're playing somebody I found really interesting and maybe cutthroat in an interesting way. And so really liked that the first couple plays of it, and even enjoyed my first few plays of it online. But then it sort of became clear to me, at least in my experience, there may be experts at this game who believe that I'm completely wrong about this, and I'm willing to grant them that. But it just became so zero-sum that I just felt like I wasn't even really making decisions anymore. It just felt like, okay, I obviously need to do this to avoid that, or need to do this to get that. And it just became, it became super clear as to where the paths were. And a lot of people will accuse games of like not really giving you too many choices. And whenever people do, I generally tend to be the person who's like so either oblivious or so like in the moment that I don't see that it's not giving me choices. Like, that is not really a complaint that I issue very often. So I'm sort of the last to see if a game doesn't give you many choices. But as a result of playing Seven Wonders often on BGA, it really, really became clear that, at least I felt that like there wasn't much choosing for me, and it just became like, you're going down this path, this is the obvious selection here. And for me, just like it went from a game that I was really hyped on to a game that, when people were offering to play on BGA, even though it's like a relatively short game on BGA, it was a game I like almost instantly turned down, and I don't turn down very many games. So yeah.
Yeah, that's funny because I was actually almost turning the opposite corner on Seven Wonders Duel, where like I had like a middling first impression of it played in person, and then started to appreciate more and more playing on BGA. But I've not played that many games of it on BGA, so you certainly take that with a grain of salt. But it's one that kind of I had this surprising like, oh, this is actually quite good, because like it's not like, I don't think, like, to your point, I don't think that the decisions are like so multifaceted and meaningful, but the thing it does really well is that very desperate tug of war tension, where it's like, okay, no, I'm like 2 turns away from losing this, and I need to like, I'm like fighting on the edge of this cliff, like trying to make sure that I don't go down because of like a military loss or something like that. I think that works. That felt pretty well good to me. But the game that I had the biggest turnaround in that direction for was Ginkgopolis, where I remember playing it with you and Kellen and kind of thinking like, oh yeah, this is, we'd heard a lot of people raving about it at that point. I believe that the folks at So Very Wrong About Games are big fans of this, and we played that game and had a good impression of it. But now every time I play it on Board Game Arena, I'm just largely like, this game, it just feels like arbitrary nonsense to me. And for a specific reason, like I want to be quite specific here. It's like your turn is entirely dictated by the cards you draw in any given round. And a lot of times you'll just look at your hand and be like, I don't want to do any of these things. And that's a whole turn of like a area control game where turns can pivot the entire game state pretty dramatically. That gets lost. And it just, every time that happens, it just feels really, really, really bad. And also, like, I kind of feel like the game state, even in like smaller games, is just so in flux to the point that it kind of just feels so meaningless. But yeah, I really turned harshly on Ginkgopolis.
Yeah, I haven't played enough even online to sort of know how I land on it. It does still feel like an opaque game for me, so I'm still, again, little in flux about how I feel about it. But I definitely have felt those feelings when playing it. Like, one person can build something in the middle of the board, and all of a sudden a whole bunch of things you were counting on have changed. Another game that went from initially a good first impression to one that actually fairly quickly soured. This was actually a pretty pivotal game. For as little as I talk about this game, I sort of in some ways mark all my game playing from before playing this game to after playing this game. And this is what I don't think I've ever brought this game up. But Arcane Academy. Okay? Arcane Academy, I think Eric Lang is one of the designers of it. Let me see.
Oh yeah, it's funny. I remember this game. It's definitely game. I remember this game like coming out and then not thinking too much about it.
Totally fair. So I was sort of like in my heyday of in the heat of the hobby. Like I'm like super excited. I'm watching all videos. Every game that's going to be coming out, I'm super excited about. And so this is in the middle of that. And this game was relatively hot. Some really good designers. There was a buzz about it, and got my hands on it and brought it to a game night, just excited to play it, and played it. And I'll be completely honest with the listeners here. Like, I don't even remember exactly how it worked. I just remember it being like a very plain, and I faintly remember some interesting aspects of it, but for the most part, it was like a very resource conversion game. And it was the moment where the rose-colored glasses fell off. Like when you're a kid, like every movie's great. Even bad movies, like, oh my God, this is a movie and it's going to be fun and whatever. And I still feel that way about board games to some extent. Like, even an average board game experience is a fun time for me in general. But after playing that, I just was like, oh, this is like boring. And even the shine and stuff is not really helping at all. And there was just something that cracked in me when I played it. Again, did not ruin the experience. Like, I went on to do a board game podcast, for goodness sake. So like, I still loved games, but there was just like, there was some like illusion that fell that thankfully didn't sour the whole hobby to me, but like there was just something very clear about what it was doing that just threw me off. And I played it one more time and still had the same feeling. Again, I don't even remember it well enough to tell you how the game works, but I just remember like this is like the game in my head that just was, this is what it is, and there's all the dressing up is not making this game any more interesting. So it's just a very pivotal experience. And I guess good to bad, I put this in the good to bad category, even though there wasn't very much good. It was just like the hype going in was I was very high on it, and I was very excited, and that was a game that sort of tamped down my excitement for future games to some extent.
It's funny because like I actually have a very similar experience that this is reminding me of, and I don't know why specifically. Maybe it was just like looking at the bright colors of Arcane Academy, but like I remember thinking that about Century Spice Road, where like there was so much buzz going into that. I think it must have been a Gen Con if I remember correctly. I think it was probably the first Gen Con that Kellen and I went to, like pre Board Game Barrage, if I remember correctly, when Board Game Barrage was just an Instagram account that Kellen was running. And we went to Gen Con and was like, we have to go and sit down and play this game because everyone's talking about Century Spice Road. We played it, and, you know, we played a demo game. It was like, oh, man, this is really good. I immediately bought, like, a copy of it, and then we went to the hotel and played it. And then Kellen and I played it a couple of times and was like, is this that good? And we kind of came down to it, like, almost instantaneously. Yeah. And, like, just feeling, when you're out somewhere and you're excited to do a thing, and just feeling that hype deflate that quickly. I remember thinking, like, oh, this just feels really bad. Like just watching that, like that hype cycle in like the short under like that intensive lens, just was like this like microcosm of that thing we all go through when we're excited about a new game. And usually it takes longer than that, rather than like 12 hours. But that's funny. One recent example I wanted to talk about, which I think is going to like make maybe people a little bit mad. I know John Company 2 is such a beloved darling. John Company 2nd edition, rather. My experience of this wasn't really mired by the game. I think that there's a lot that I sometimes disagree or sort of have to like find myself fighting against when it comes to Cole Worley designs. And the specific thing that happened in our game of John Company, which is a quite long game that we were playing at a convention over the course of a long period of time, with unfortunately like a break for lunch in the middle. So just, it was so mired by not a bad player, but a player playing badly and playing in a way that made no sense. Like I am all for like pulling levers in games, but this was, oh, I'm just going to do this thing. And it's like, no, we're ruining this for everyone. This entire alliance is now crumbling because of this stupid decision you decide to do. And we've been here for 4 hours, you know? It was like the most aggravating experience. And I think it was so bad. It just like watching how fragile that game can be, but you know, by design, like this is a storytelling engine to some extent, but watching how fragile like everyone's experience could be ruined by one person playing suboptimally just really soured me on the whole thing, to the extent that I don't think I'm ever going to play John Company 2nd edition again, which is kind of a bummer because it seems like a very special game for the people that really, really love it.
Yeah. Look, I'm not a fan of John Company. I haven't played 2nd edition, but I was such a not fan of the 1st edition that I just hesitate to play 2nd edition. So it's hard for me to defend it, but it sucks that it was somebody playing not only suboptimally, but suboptimally like on purpose for no reason, like acknowledged for no reason.
Yeah, exactly. And despite protestation, you know, like being told, like, no, please don't do this, and they would still terrible. Do it. So that was aggravating. Yeah. And the thing that kind of like gets me thinking about a lot is like kind of how really like fragile games like that can be in terms of like how we come to them over the course of the hobby. Because I'm not unaware of the fact that some of my favorite games are similar in that regard. Stationfall, for example, can absolutely be like that. You can have games of Stationfall where through someone's actions, the entire game just like short circuits. If you've played Stationfall enough, you've definitely had that game of it where your entire plan goes out the window because someone let out Project X or someone took out the reactor core, and then suddenly the whole game pivots around that. And that's either amazing or it could just feel like this bucket of water thrown on you. And I can see someone's first experience of like a rather long game or long heavy game being entirely ruined if you're not just along for the ride with it, or that you don't have enough confidence in the game that it's, hey, this is part of what the game can be. And that was the thing where I kind of felt like if I think about it rationally, I could get over that hurdle with John Company, but it's so
tough. Like as you're saying, like with a long, heavy game, even if you can again rationalize that, like, okay, obviously there's this one player who did something that is clearly, you know, I would say undisputably like poor play, like poor, like negative affecting the rest of the table play. You can rationalize that, but then like to get yourself up for playing another heavy, long game of it where you're going to need the rules refreshing and all that stuff, it is a hurdle that totally makes sense for sure.
Yeah.
One more game for me from the initial bad play to now it's a game that I quite enjoy. And this is a game that never really was a bad experience for me, but it's another game, maybe like Arc Nova, where my first couple plays of it were ho-hum, and I didn't really think much of it, was Hanabi. And I think this was a result of playing it with my game group when I first played it, where we played it fairly competitively. Now, this is a cooperative game, but I mean competitively, like versus the game where we were trying to achieve the highest scores. And so we fell into sort of some of the traps that people complain about with Hanabi, where, the game tells you that you aren't supposed to communicate at all, but you have conventions, and then it becomes a game of like sticking to conventions that you and the other players have. And then is that the game? And it sort of becomes a little muddled. And I always enjoyed it, but never really sought it out. And, for as highly regarded as it is and as innovative as the game is, I just never thought to really play it because, again, it became a game of like, okay, well, we're at conventions again. Now I'm really nervous that I'm not reading the signs that the players are doing that we have sort of all agreed on, and now it's like a game of like following rules that I may have forgotten, and we'll just sort of like tamped it down. But I recently, about a year ago, me and my girlfriend went to a board game cafe, and we wanted to play some cooperative games, and I introduced her to Hanabi, and just playing Hanabi with somebody who is like not going to be tied to these conventions, not going to be like super focused on winning or like doing things the right way, just made it a much, much more enjoyable experience. And since then, I've played it with other non-quote-unquote gamers or, hobbyists. And it's just been a wonderful experience to teach this, like, cooperative fun with this, like, interesting twist for people who aren't hobbyists game. And has just made Hanabi a game that now I do seek out as a game to play, again, with the right group. I still wouldn't play it with like my game group because of the worry that it just become like the follow the rules sort of thing. But with people who aren't hobbyists, like it's been a fantastic game to pull out, and one that I've enjoyed quite a bit since playing it again.
Wow, you do one episode on So Very Wrong About Games, you're coming back with all of their hobbyist versus
Look, I'm constantly
rules.
evolving. I'm constantly learning.
One more quick one to close out, because this is kind of already partly fits, but it's recent and like a little bit relevant. But based off of the high of Azul and how fantastic that game is, I remember being very excited when Stained Glass of Sintra came out, because I love the idea of taking a rule set and evolving and changing it. I remember reading the rules for Sintra and then entirely writing it off and just being like, this just feels like Azul with more steps. It's just more rules. It's bad. And then I didn't play it for what's been like 6-7 years now. I don't even know how long it's been since Sintra came out. Maybe not that long, but a very, very long time, until yesterday. For the first time, I played Stained Glass of Sintra, and it's fantastic. It might be the best Azul. I somehow played every other Azul except Sintra because of just that bad first impression of having read the rules for it and like completely misjudging it. To be fair, I think there were more mitigating circumstances about why I didn't end up playing it in the meantime, but it just kind of just left this like negative, I don't need to play that kind of thing in the back of my head. Yeah, it's really, really excellent.
That's awesome. I love that.
I would highly recommend it. But yeah, that is, I think, going to wrap us up for this topic and for the episode. Thank you again to Jaron for that suggestion, and a reminder that you can send us suggestions for future topics at boardgamebarrage.com/topics. Thank you all for listening to this week's episode. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music, What's in Your Mind, Kid? Please follow us wherever you follow your things, whether that's on, I don't know where I was going with that exactly, but whether that's on Twitter, whether that's on Facebook. We are also on Discord. We have a lovely, 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 amazing community. I've said this time and time again, and this is something that came up as a topic in the Discord recently. I forget where exactly. There are very few things I'm as proud of being involved as the amazing community on our Discord. So if you're not a part of that, there's no better time than right now by heading over to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord if you just want to hang out with other listeners, other board gamers, a lot of people in there that don't listen, a lot of people that are just there to meetups or playing digital games with one another. We are always there chatting all the time as well. So if you want to join that lovely community, that is at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. That is going to do it for this week's episode. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Okay. You ready?
Yes.
Recording there. Okay. Oops, sorry.
Oh, did you say anything?
I gotta count, don't I? 3, 2, 1.
Were you counting in your head there?
No, I just clapped.
Okay.
I'm just like, I need to count. We're gonna both clap. We're gonna clap.
Yeah, we're clapping. Figured
sync.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just look in my eyes. Okay. Things and rings, Yedo. Okay.